Hi, I'm Ali and a warm welcome to the Ceramic Repair Studio. So in today's video, I thought I would just sort of go through some of the principles I use when sanding an item. Now, as you can see here, I actually have a lid here from a ginger jar, a Chinese ginger jar. And I've previously in another video, I've actually put it back together because it was broken in half. And I've also applied some Milliput here. Now, because it had some cracks in there and it was missing a few pieces. Now, I just very quickly, the Milliput I did use, the colour I used was silver grey for reference, just because rather than a white, obviously the base with Chinese is slightly more of a blue tinge, blue grey. Now, when I have my sandpaper, I use a Matador, and it is a waterproof wet and dry sandpaper, and if you look on the back of them, they always have the grades, and so I like to sort of work my way along the grades, and in the end I like to finish off with a micro mesh, which is almost like it's a cloth, and that really is a very fine one, which finishes at a 12,000, and that almost makes it feel like glass at the end. Then it's ready for either painting or airbrushing. So I just want to sort of show you a few examples. So once I start obviously with a slightly more coarse one, and I tend to break off the sandpaper in a little piece. Try not to break off the bits which actually says the actual number, so then you've got a good reference when you look at the back again. And when I start to sand, I would take my piece and I would just lightly sand it, just touching the Milliput, not any of the other area of the material. And I would do this until it starts to sort of rub down quite nicely. And then after that, I would then work down again along. So then I would go on to the next one, which would be a 320. And then again, I would then move on to this one, which would be a 600. 800, and work along until I get to almost the, say, I'm just showing an example, of 1200, and then I would take the 1200. By this point it would be quite flush. Now when it starts getting quite flush, you don't want to just be sanding up and down the Milliput. You actually want it, so there's always an area where it's slightly higher up and raised. You actually want to work against it. Otherwise you end up, with it, otherwise you end up with a ridge. So if you've got a piece which is, so if it's slightly higher up there, you would actually have the higher part and you would just work along, just blending it through. If you're going in an up and down motion, you will end up with a ridge, and then you'll have to sort of apply more Milliput again, let it dry to then really make it flush. And so you just want to very, very carefully, when it gets towards the end, for instance, just keep sanding, and again not touching too much of the original, but just a little bit, just so it blends through. Again, by this point it's quite a fine sand, so you're not going to damage your piece. Obviously if it's got gilding, you obviously don't want to be rubbing on any gilding, so obviously it will rub off, and so you would just keep doing that. If you do have sort of areas where there are tight corners or small pieces, which areas where it's very difficult to get into, you can always get yourself a cocktail stick, and I tend to wrap it round, for instance, the piece of sandpaper, and then you can really get in, for instance, into a crevice with your cocktail stick, or you could use a pencil. Now when it comes to the very end part, for instance, say this is now all sanded and I've gone along all the levels and it's feeling very flush, I always like to finish off with a micro mesh. As I said before, this is a 12,000, and then again I would then literally go in around circular motion and just blend it all through. Again, not touching too much the original, but just to really help make that really flush and smooth. And that again, it would end up, you'd be able to know that it's finished. And how you know when your item is completely finished is that when you close, if you close your eyes, take your finger and then just rub along. And if you can't feel any indentations or bumps, you know your piece is then finished sanding, ready for painting, and possibility of if you're using a air gun, so an airbrush. So there we are, that's kind of the basics to sanding. Again, I go along the levels, I finish off with this with a micro mesh, and I always kind of work against or with, depending, but I never go completely up and down because you don't want any ridges. And then try not to work too much on your, touch too much of your original item. So I hope this makes sense, and I hope you enjoy the video. Again, please give it a thumbs up if you enjoyed the video and found it useful. Please comment down below. I always try to answer all the comments, and please subscribe, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Okay, bye.